Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And welcome to the side sessions of the third UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. So this session will focus on human rights due diligence integral to business and trade in South Asia, which will be hosted by Amfori. So this is just one of the several side sessions leading up to the plenary forum happening from the March 28th to the 30th in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And just a quick note, everyone, that this is being recorded right now. And we are also live on YouTube. So if you could share this to your colleagues and to your friends, it would be great if they can tune in also to us. And we are so glad to have you all here and just to have a few things for us to keep in mind during the duration of the session. Number one is like, we would love to see you. And if you are asking questions later, please do turn on your camera. Or if you're speaking during the session, please do turn on your camera so we can see you. And number two, you can post also your thoughts or your comments or your questions in the chat box. Or if you can also use the raised hand function in the Zoom window. Okay, so it's located right there at the bottom of your screen. Just click the reactions and click raise hand. Okay, so to formally start our session, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Linda Kromjong, the president of amfori, and for her opening remarks. Linda, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Kassika, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I wish it's a good day, and I'm really looking forward to an engaged discussion here also on behalf of amfori. First of all, let me not forget thanking the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, the United Nations Development Programme, but also International Labour Organization for organizing this important forum. It's not the first. I hope it's also not going to be the last, because it is really absolutely important that we continue to exchange views in order to make sure that we are all contributing to, I would say, a better life and livelihood for everyone, and that we are active in preventing, mitigating, and remediating any business-related business human rights abuses, but also really progress the decent work agenda in South Asia. Allow me to introduce myself and my organization. My name is Linda Kromjong. I'm the president of amfori. And at amfori, we support over 2,500 members, small and big companies, to manage their supply chain in a responsible manner. Approaches from both the environmental as well as from the social angle. And we do this by offering tools and services such as social audits, environmental risk assessment, training, capacity building, and advocacy. There are many challenges around the world nowadays, and they will not come less the way it looks now. And we can only overcome those if we choose for a collaborative approach. So while our members can't solve them on their own, together as amfori, jointly with our networks, our partners, we can influence and drive positive change at scale. We're happy to host a session today and have chosen to engage at the dialogue on human rights due diligence. It says human rights due diligence, but more and more it's human rights and environmental due diligence. And that is integral to business and trade in South Asia. Human rights due diligence is at the heart of what companies are expected to do, managing negative impact where they might be connected to. And the concept of human rights due diligence is embedded in, say, well-known international standards. And I don't need to repeat them or go into depth. We all know the UN Guiding Principles of Human Rights. We all know the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And they are extremely important and relevant because they do inform further developments in binding legislation. And just to mention a few, the German Supply Chain Act, but also the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive proposal to come, that will have an impact on not only on companies here in Europe, but across the world. Those standards, the UN Guiding Principles of the OECD, also inform reporting standards, but also drive the expectations from stakeholders and investors. At amfori, we have been a long-standing advocate of the value add that well-designed human rights due diligence legislation would bring. And I hope that in the 1.5 hours to come, there is going to be a lot of inspiration and challenge coming from all the participants on the panel, as well as the participants, about what is that we can do better in achieving that. I'm handing over now to Natasha. Natasha, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Linda, and many thanks for this warm welcome. And very much thank you to you, dear participants, for joining us today. Thank you to the organizers, the UN Working Group, UNDP, and ILO for bringing together this very important forum. It is an honor and a privilege for us to welcome you, and we do look forward to your engagement and your contribution to this session. We do hope you find this session stimulating as well as productive. For today, our topic for discussion is HRDD, which is integral to business and trade in South Asia. Of course, this is also defining the changing landscape for business and trade in South Asia. And we do want to share that if you have any questions, please do enter them into the chat, raise your hand, be comfortable to bring them to our attention. We will be very happy to address them. Keep the questions flowing, as and when we do have interaction with the audience, we will address your questions. But before we go any further, allow me to reach out to you participants with a poll question. Let me ask you, how aware are you of human rights due diligence? And we will have a poll come up. You will see it on your screen. It will give you 4 options where you could choose. Are you very aware? Are you moderately aware? Are you a little aware? Or are you unaware? It's a whole new concept, and it is an evolving concept. So that is also a likely possibility. Do share with us, and we await your responses. For those of you still pondering over, we can see we have some responses and some of you are still awaited. Please go ahead and make your selection. You could simply just click onto your option and click OK. Okay, we do end the poll now, and we do see that majority of you are moderately aware and some of you are very aware, which is good to see. And our ambition and aim here is to also familiarize you even deeper with how this does have a lot more repercussion in business as we go ahead in time. So joining us today, we also have Dorothy Lovell, who's joining us as a policy advisor of responsible business conduct at OECD. Viraf Mehta, who joins us from who is an advisor and joins us from Partners in Change. Pranav Kumar, who's joining us from the Confederation of Indian Industry. He's the Chief of International Trade Policy there. And Indras Ghosh, who's the Acting Head for Sustainability Projects at Indo-German Chamber of Commerce. Before we actually delve into the conversation, allow me to share with you, for those of you who are still not very aware and are moderately aware, that the first globally accepted standard holding both businesses and governments accountable for adverse human rights impacts is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also known very commonly as the UNGP. Endorsed by the international community in 2011, the UNGP is regarded as the most widely accepted framework for responsible business conduct. Therein, due diligence features as essential for a company to exercise its responsibility to respect human rights, and thus, amongst other things, to also remediate adverse impact. The political momentum that was generated by the UNGP has also led to progressive integration of elements of responsible business conduct, due diligence in policy, and legal frameworks for responsible business. Notably, governments, both within and outside of the EU, have started to introduce laws to regulate corporate human rights due diligence, both through reporting requirements and obligations to conduct due diligence. Respecting human rights has also been acknowledged as key to the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the SDGs. In the wake of increased attention to business-related human rights risks and impacts, multilateral organizations have created several instruments that provide guidance on responsible business practice. These include the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the ILO Tripartite Declaration of Principles Concerning Multinational Enterprises. On February 23rd this year, the European Commission published its long-awaited proposal for a Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This sets out the requirements for companies to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence in their value chain. The proposed directive is addressed at member states. They will have to ensure that companies conduct human rights and environmental due diligence at the level of operations, their own operations, also of their subsidiaries, and value chain operations of entities with which the company has an established business relationship. So this extends to trade partners also. Today, we will explore the repercussions that HRDD could have on global trade, the mix of policy measures that governments can use to meet their state duty to protect human rights, business responses to the due diligence frameworks, and the rising expectations from stakeholders, as well as tools and initiatives for businesses to meet their responsibility to respect human rights and remain competitive. With this context, let me reach out to all of you joining us today with another poll question. And I now ask you, what you know and understand, respond with that. What can states do to ensure businesses are compliant with international human rights standards? A, enforce existing laws. B, identify and address any policy or regulatory gaps. C, provide effective guidance to business. And D, foster business respect for human rights both at home and away. And the last option, which is all the above. So we give you a few seconds to complete your answers. Perfect. I would close the poll now. I do share the results with you. It is interesting to see that majority have responded with all of the above, and that is the correct answer. Yes, all of the above are very relevant. And actually with this context, I would like to invite Dorothy Lowell, as well as Viraf Mehta, to join me in a conversation.
Hello, Natasha. Thanks so much for inviting us here.
Welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you here. And we do await to see Viraf also joining us in, I think.
I'm here.
Okay, super. Great. Thank you, Viraf. So Dorothy, with this, I'd actually first turn to you. Maybe if you could help us, and shed some light on how are governments responding to the international frameworks on HRDD, and what is the mix of policy measures governments can use to meet their state duty to protect human rights? What are the key drivers of policies?
Sure, thanks so much, Natasha. And it's a real pleasure to join you all today on this panel. So I'm Dorothy Lovell, and I'm working at the OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct. And as you already heard, we have a very important international instrument on responsible business conduct, which of course includes human rights as one of the chapters of the guidelines for multinational enterprises. So, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to say that these international instruments were actually created and endorsed by governments. So it's, they're very much owners of these instruments. And they didn't do this on their own. They introduced it through consensus building with business, trade unions, and civil society organizations. Last year marked the 10-year anniversary for two of these very important instruments that have already been mentioned. So the 10-year anniversary since the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights came about, which of course created the definition of due diligence in the context of human rights and the role for business and government, and the important pillar of remedy too, which often gets a little bit overlooked. And then the OECD, whose instrument, the M&E guidelines, dates back to the 1970s, 10 years ago, last year, updated that instrument to include this concept of due diligence and a human rights chapter. And so it's also important to note that governments have been very much at the forefront of working towards alignment between these international instruments so that governments start to pull in the right direction. However, I think last year we saw a lot of reflection on how this is going, 10 years since these instruments were updated and introduced. And of course, not seeing quite enough movement and impact towards the sustainable development goals, which we all know human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence is there to really, well, it's really the main way that businesses can contribute to the sustainable development goals. And as a reminder of what that means addressing the impacts in the supply chain, in their own operations, that the negative impacts and actually going beyond that, so actually creating good impacts to business, to workers and the environment and communities. So just to say, governments are very much behind these instruments. However, I think it's fair to say, and I think one of those poll answers in particular was very interesting. So to identify and address any policy or regulatory gaps, I think it's fair to say governments are realizing that they're not putting all of their weight behind this movement towards uptake and implementation of human rights due diligence. And there are other tools in their policy toolbox that they can use to promote and expect businesses to put in place human rights and environmental due diligence. We're talking more in the context of human rights today, but I think it's important to note businesses have a responsibility across all these different issues and sustainable development goals. So some examples we've heard, governments are starting to bring in legislation to mandate due diligence, which is of course an important step forward, and it's quite exciting moment to have, as you mentioned, Natasha, the EU directive come in, or the draft proposal at least last month, but we've also seen the German supply chain law. We've also, it's been a few years now, of course, that the French have had a law on the loi de vigilance, which requires French companies to actually publish a plan on how they're going to address due diligence, responsible business conduct risks in their supply chains. So yes, this landscape is definitely changing, and I think we can assume and see that there will be a huge impact across global supply chains relating to these expectations, often at the market level. However, governments also have been using other tools such as trade policy. So we've seen the EU have within its free trade agreements a chapter on sustainable development expectations for trading partners. We've also seen, as example, governments try and facilitate and provide extra guidance to businesses on what they should be doing. And one key example that I can share is the fact that the OECD has created a number of different sector-specific guidances to businesses on human rights due diligence and other, obviously, environmental and corruption due diligence. And this has been supported by governments. So in the case of some of our guidance is supported by OECD members and including the EU. And I think also to note, governments are using other tools such as investment strategies to really try and enhance and promote due diligence. And last but not least, in fact, thinking about how they spend their own money. So also public procurement, which as we know is about 12% of GDP. That's a huge potential really to leverage due diligence and responsible business conduct. So I think just to say, of course, that governments have been behind these instruments from the outset, but I think what is changing is this sense of governments needing to talk internally and get their own houses in order, to work between ministries, which is not actually very simple, and to try and get all the different policy tools at their disposal working towards the same objectives. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. That is really very interesting. And you also shed light on how it's not necessarily all very easy. There is a whole mix and a mechanism that's actually working together to bring this. But let me turn to you, Viraf, on this. How are these frameworks on HRDD relevant to the South Asian context?
Enormously so. And I think in taking up a challenge to answer that, I think in two ways. In the first instance, I think that the real challenge over the last decade, once we had the UNGPs before us, was to integrate human rights into prior RBC or responsible business conduct frameworks. And any of us who engaged with businesses 10 and 15 and 20 years ago and even more, these words were simply not available in the boardroom. They were not commented on, and they were in general terms of social and labor and welfare, philanthropy, and so forth. So I think at the first level, the importance of these issues is, of course, that South Asia is fully aware, our nations, of the human rights challenges that we have. And these are clearly known to everybody. And the sheer numbers of people amongst those who are linked one way or the other through their place in an informal economy to ultimately large buyers overseas or within the country itself. And not to underestimate the need of the hour to, before we talk about the second two letters, D and D, due diligence, I think it's worth stating that business in many of our South Asian countries really need to ramp up their capacities and knowledge about what human rights are and are not, and what they are clearly expected to do. And to that extent, I'm delighted colleagues from business chambers are here because they have a huge role to play in ramping up this capacity. The second part is that comment would be that its relevance here is from the human rights point of view, an acknowledgement by the state. Certainly Pakistan now has an NAP, we're working on ours, as are other South Asian nations. But I think, just referring back to the second poll question, we know the shortcomings of our state in terms of implementing some outstanding laws on paper, outstanding policies, very good NAPs and so forth. And we can't go down the path without new tools and hope that, they will be well implemented this time because of the SDGs are 9 years or 8 years away. No, I think that the renewed focus in the 10 plus in the next decade of the UNGPs urge us to look at the full power of the market, financial sector, banks, investors, and what you touched upon. I think I must congratulate Dorothy and her team for the work that OECD have done on human rights due diligence and public procurement. And the link to the poll question is that we're only looking at the role of the state then as a regulator, when we know the weaknesses of prior approaches that have not improved conditions for victims of human rights or adverse impacts caused by business. But if we look at the inherent incentives available with governments in South Asia being huge procurers, number one, procurers of goods and services from SMEs, from the private sector in their respective countries, and of course the role that they play in introducing or negotiating human rights in international bilateral and multilateral trade treaties. Their role, I think, in the marketplace is where we should also bring attention and ask for more discussion in terms of this. I think in terms of the relevance here of also asking the state to take a lead before we begin a full spotlight on just the private sector, which is relatively small compared to the size and the scale of government that we have. And we're fortunate to have that. Certainly in India, this is the case. The last part of the answer is on due diligence per se as a process. There is no doubt, and if readers of, for example, Indian business audience or business leaders were to look way back in 2011 at the National Voluntary Guidelines, and then in 2018-19 at the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct, they will find an endorsement by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, Government of India, of the Protect Respect remedy and the alignment in the next version of a human rights due diligence. The CI itself, as an apex business membership organization with over 10,000 members, issued an advisory to its members way back 3-4 years ago in terms of the steps that companies have to take from a policy. We have enhanced the reporting mechanisms for companies to report on these guidelines. But due diligence, I mean, and I don't mean this lightly, I was thinking just before the session that I must consult with my South Asian friends, because I can't think actually of an accurate way to translate human rights due diligence into a single Indian language or a South Asian one. And this happens with other jargon. I mean, the overlapping words for responsibility and accountability, for example. And this means that the localizing of this concept, I think, in terms of a way forward, would require a continuation from where good efforts have been made with things business are already familiar with. They know about EIA and SIA.
I think it's touching upon the challenges, and it goes down into implementation and how we can start building more familiarity with it, underlying. And with this, I'm going to turn to you, Dorothy, for a second, to really delve a bit deeper also, before we come back to you, Viraf, on this, on what really are these challenges in implementing the frameworks, and how can they really be, how can we drive implementation, taking forward from what Viraf says on, localizations and going down deeper into awareness and so on. But even as we look at it from a top-down approach, what can drive implementation and impact? And without it just being a mere checkbox exercise, how do we drive that impact?
Sure, thanks. And yeah, I think it's a great comment from Viraf about the challenges of even translating the terms. We obviously are trying to have our guidances translated into many, many languages, and we always come across this. And also aligning, of course, with how the UN is translating the business and human rights principles. So, I mean, just quickly on a few key challenges, I think they're fairly obvious in a way. So one is clearly capacity and know-how, and I'll kind of bunch into that bucket also visibility challenges about knowing the supply chain. If a business is required to, by law, for example, in the context of the human rights due diligence legislation we've been discussing, to report on risks in its supply chain and in its own operations and what it's done to address those risks and impacts, it's impossible to do that without knowing its supply chain, and and knowing what it's required to do in terms of acting to prevent and address those risks. And so really visibility challenges are key, not least because it can drive companies without good support to perhaps de-risk from certain supply chains. And that is not a goal that the OECD would particularly support, since it doesn't contribute to actually addressing the issues at hand and the sustainable development challenges we all face. So having capacity and building capacity both amongst global multinational enterprises that are having to maybe meet these laws that are perhaps coming more from the market side, but also for their suppliers. And then linked to capacity building is finance, which is, I guess, the second point. Got to acknowledge that the incentives, the business incentives, are not there through sometimes the kind of costing frameworks that already exist in global supply chains to really enable suppliers, manufacturers in South Asia, in Brazil, wherever, to actually invest in their businesses in order to ensure that they are meeting the kind of pollution requirements, they're paying living wages, etc. That's required of them. we've seen some quite innovative financing models come out. For example, the ITC, the IFC support for supplier financing, which actually kind of conditionalizes financing towards better responsible business practices at the site level, which is very interesting and exciting and can change the incentives. So lots of interesting models out there, but this is still a huge challenge across many, many sectors. And then the last point is really commitment. And I think it's also, these are all interlinked, of course, but you need buyers to commit to supporting suppliers and to give them long forecasts and orders so that the suppliers can really feel the incentives to put in place their own human rights due diligence, especially where perhaps they are not directly needing to report under a law, and they're only doing it based on the fact that they're in the supply chain of a company that comes under the jurisdiction of some of these new laws. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Dorothy. I'm going to pick on, what you mentioned, and actually come back to you, Viraf, also on a point that you touched upon, when you spoke about the national guidelines for responsible business conduct, and prior to that, the national voluntary guidelines and the NVGs. So, as you shared that this process of reporting, and disclosures has been already active in India for almost a decade now. But in spite of this decade-old reporting and disclosure format, there are gaps in the implementation of responsible business conduct and human rights due diligence. So what is it that why is it that there are still these gaps? What are the challenges we're seeing there? And also, to what extent is it that the standards are driven through export expectations versus local drivers?
Okay, thank you. I think the way to, conceptually address or connect the dots between the issues that you've mentioned, Natasha, one is that recall that for a previous century, we did not have non-financial data mandated. So a decade is just 10% of that time. And to do it in the way that was done, if you think of it, you've said national voluntary guidelines led to mandatory reporting requirements, at least from the point of view of this listed companies in the stock exchange. The good news is wait for version 2. It's BRSR now, it's called, and based on the first 5 years, because I think the first reports were about 2013, if I'm not mistaken, around that time. So many civil society organizations, of which we are part, Corporate Responsibility Watch and others, the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, many other researchers, have now evaluated BRR reporting in terms of the gaps, both in questions and the responses by companies. Starting this coming fiscal, there will be a new reporting framework based on civil society, trade union, worker, business, environmental groups feedback. So I think you're going to see, first of all, a vastly enhanced and more robust framework. And secondly, beginning with 100 companies way back in 2011, it's 1,000 now. And these are the biggest and the most influential companies across sectors. Accompanying this, in support of what Dorothy said, that we are in the process already of devising sector-specific supplements, as also methodologies for aggregate reporting. And this is very important to SMEs because we're not in the trajectory of burdening small, medium enterprise with individual reports. But certainly when they are aggregated, whether they are small T holders, whether they are association in an Indian cluster, and support small micro enterprises, but 10,000 of them. So what would cluster reporting look like, etc.? So I think in the second comment is that communicating to stakeholders is the fourth and final part of a due diligence process, right? Right from understanding your human rights impact or doing a human rights impact assessment, then the internal stuff about integrating and tracking, monitoring, and lastly, of course, communicating. In a perfect world, we would go sequentially, but the driver of reporting is not yet exhausted. I think we have to wait another 3-4 years to see how these are, the uptake. We're hopeful. I think in South Asia, from conversations with other nations, that the financial sector, the stock exchanges, investor groups want the information that is that is coming out of these to take some serious decisions, or to be able to play their role as respecting this data that is coming out in the public domain to make informed choices about their investments in the private sector. Similarly, I think, and this is a conversation I'm very interested to have with Dorothy and Chambers subsequently, is how this data can inform public procurement and how the wider process of due diligence, particularly this last leg of communicating. Of course, the last part is that just putting information in the public domain is insufficient without some incentives and some penalties for information. For example, if we gave incorrect fiscal financial information, we could be delisted a company, we could be imprisoned, fined, and so forth. What about with this information? And I think from company side, they will be careful. Their legal team will advise us how to meet the quality and the openness and the transparency that disclosure requires, along with how an ombudsman could actually look at quality reports and encourage through access to supply chains, if it's from small, medium enterprise, access to longer period commercial relationships, as Dorothy mentioned, access to public procurement through this. But in India, and I would argue that until the voices of the people, meaning whether they're workers in supply chains, whether they're communities impacted, whether they are vulnerable or excluded consumers, to how to get stakeholder engagement processes that we all endorse through the OECD guidelines and even ours. What is the relationship between this information and affected groups, not just user groups in terms of investors and state? And is there a space that we can create in reporting where ultimately, I think that the credibility that would come from voices themselves from the supply chain endorsing a company's action or contesting it is good enough for many of us, rather than, and I'll end on this, repeating any prior error over the last 20 years of trying to improve, for example, labor rights through policing and simply compliance-driven industry that has patently not delivered on just workplace rights, let alone human rights and beyond that. So I think that there is space for introspection on previous things that have simply not worked and completely avoiding those errors, but they lie in empowering people who are affected by this entire, in the supply chain, for example, to have a page or a space to hear their voices. Our voices in terms of making frameworks and submitting them to government and analyzing reports are all good, but how do we link it to a serious rights holder engagement process by companies? Are we expecting companies to have separate reports for stakeholder groups? And what would that entail? Or should civil society representatives of these groups demystify some of these reports and indicators for the benefit of affected groups? Because I can't see that they will have the credibility or the impact without the involvement of affected people. And this is a challenge that many of us even at this forum have raised and are discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Viraf. I will actually turn to you, Dorothy, to also kind of shed some light on what is the domestic versus international market need for implementing HRDB?
Well, I mean, I think from the conversation, where we came from in the outset of this conversation, noting, the increasing amount of due diligence law being introduced by governments, particularly, for example, that are key markets for South Asian industry. There's this perception, of course, that that human rights due diligence is being driven, through the market mechanisms and through the export potential. And of course, in some South Asian economies, that doesn't ring very strongly because of such, huge domestic industry and markets, such as, India, as we've heard from Varav. So, I think it's important to kind of demystify a bit as well that assumption. I think it's true that some of the key drivers are coming from the market, but I think also, we know that consumers are increasingly concerned about human rights due diligence, both on domestic and international level. We have seen examples of, the increase in kind of pride around South Asian brands and brands being able to also drive this demand through their domestic supply chains as well. Also, I think it's important to note that some South Asian economies are not just kind of producers and exporters, but are also middle actors in the chain, in the economy. So particularly in the gold sector, recently, we've seen some interesting advances where in the last few years, I think it's the Indian National Stock Exchange, the Indian Multi-Commodity Exchange, and as well as the Bombay Stock Exchange have actually adopted OECD guidance on minerals as a requirement for trading gold via their exchanges. So that, of course, requires Indian companies bringing gold into the country to actually do due diligence on how the gold was mined in the countries from which they're sourcing, in order to pass that information also then onto the market and to be even able to trade. So it's not a simple answer. I think it's important to acknowledge South Asian economies are very much part of a bigger chain in many instances, and there's lots of different drivers. And I hope that the gap is closing a little bit between this kind of export versus domestic drivers.
That's an interesting perspective, and also an important one, because in many ways it's not just international drivers, but there are domestic needs and domestic drivers also for implementing HRDD. With this, Virav, let me come to you with one last question before we go to the audience. And maybe you could share with us, what is the value of working towards SDG 17, that is partnerships on implementing HRDD?
Okay, well, that's a great one, because way back, if I don't know how many of our audience would even recall this, but in 91, 92, there was the International Business Leaders Forum. I was part of this. We were actually partnership practitioners. We, believed that partnership was something that needed to be taught, and they were partnership practitioners. I think over time, the word partnership has ceased to mean what it should and what it did. And if you take a poll and ask 10 people to give you 10 characteristics of a successful partnership, you probably get very, very different answers, some common ones. So I think in the past, some of the partnership things we understand: shared risk, common vision, and shared benefits, shared goals. But you have to manage a partnership, and a partnership is not a relationship. It's a cyclical process with steps, and every step of the partnership, from deciding who your partners are right to winding them up at the end, evaluating them in between, are things that are not necessarily being taught. And I just bring reference to the role here that the best and the brightest of our business education, management education should be doing. So many comments about capacity, but I think there's been a bit of a lagging behind by business schools in teaching this and researching these things. So partnerships, I think what was missing prior to 2011 is that it's easy to say at one level that business would come to the table to improve the rights of a child in the supply chain. Civil society organization with a similar mandate would bring its expertise, and then state authorities in a tri-sector partnership, let's say, or a bi-sector one just between business and civil society. But agreeing to work on a rights-based approach has to be explicit, and it never was in the past. And this is why a lot of the partnerships fails, because civil society felt that if it took a rights-based approach, it might deter business at that time. Business was not fully knowledgeable as it should be about, for example, all the rights of a child and the impacts it has on them beyond, at that time, just understanding no child labor and right to education and a few others. So I think that we have the cement for partnerships existing in business and human rights through the UNGPs, the OECD guidelines, and so forth. This is clear, and our national ones. And it would require these partnerships to explicitly adopt a rights-based approach to the issue at hand and to reinforce each other's roles and responsibilities in that process. The ending comment here is that these partnerships are absolutely vital, but you require skills to manage a partnership. You require to agree on elements of the partnership that are agreed upon in formal and informal ways. And we have to promote that at the heart of this partnership and the achievement of the SDG that you mentioned is a knowledge that at least one of the contributing factors to the MDGs not being met was the absence of a clear articulation on the role of the private sector and a framework like the UNGPs to promote human rights. Having learned those from 2000 to 2015, it would be terrible if we repeated an error that didn't lead to the achievement of the goals just at the start of the new millennium. So this is a transformative agenda. We cannot simply go forward and do little more and do little harder. It has to be solutions that have the potential to be completely magical, out of the box, with at the center. I just would like to, the last time we interacted with late Professor Ruggie was at the first Asian Regional Forum in Doha, and he said it so simply that it's about putting people first, putting people at the center of this discourse, and this is not that complicated. This is the transformation we're seeking. And to business, it's an opportunity for South Asian countries to make their rightful mark on the global economy through the protection and the betterment and realization of the rights of its citizens. So I expect leadership from South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Viraf. An important message there. Partnerships are valuable, and every stakeholder in that partnership has his own role and responsibility in where they can influence and impact, and that's where collaboration needs to also be well thought of. With this, actually, thank you so much, Dorothy and Viraf, for this very enriching conversation with us. And I would actually like to turn to the participants at the stage, all that do join us, for any questions that they have. And actually on this, I do see one question already. Viraf, it is directed towards you, if I may ask you. It does ask, what are the key challenges implementing human rights integrated to business and trade in South Asian countries in regards to national guidelines imposed? Some of these you have already answered and highlighted in terms of challenges we have together, but if there's more you'd like to add. But the second one being, do you think government approaches are comprehensive and robust to implement human rights collaborated with private sector as per national and UN guidelines?
Well, taking the second one first, in a sense, I think that part of the narrative, the way it was presented internationally, that if you like, it would be fair to say that some people in our countries and in India regard the UNGPs, unfortunately, as being at some sort of middle stage as part of the journey, and looming there is the legally binding treaty and its progress. And let's not forget, in the latest version of discussions of the legally binding treaty, it is about trade largely, and human rights due diligence is a clear pillar there. It's been there in all the drafts. So I think that I hear from many government voices that countries such as India are being circumspect about what they say in the NAP, because they want a coherence, obviously, between what they've said in less mandatory domestic situations like voluntary guidelines or national guidelines, but in legally binding requirements that would come from India taking this forward or not. So I think there's a sense of where is this headed And in a sense, I think more clarity about where this and how, what form the legally binding treaty on multinational and other business enterprises, what are the liabilities, what are the risks, are being examined. Can these or will these be used as non-tariff barriers in sourcing from us? Recent examples, I think let's look at the world. A whole range of businesses, one group, have refused to deal with Russia and the Ukraine situation. Another group continues, another group, they're different views. And it's human rights, whether it's cotton in India or in Uyghur territory, whether it's another type of commodity in a South Asian country, they have played out politically and everybody's viewed them. So I think circumspection was to be expected in terms of how human rights will play out, because patently there's no one view of business. Business have reacted in very different ways in supporting a legislation or country foreign policy. I think other statements that from the European Union, particularly their directive, it's not about putting European values down their supply chain. These are universal values, and I think we should continue to just look at the distance between when child labor will finally cease to exist in South Asia and what it really will take to do this. So my sense is there's a lot of thinking, circumspection, because there's a realization that this is a long journey. And I don't think governments are going to react hastily in terms of just absorbing a human rights due diligence practice without understanding all its ramifications. In the first question, I think there are active associations. SARC, which is what we belong to, has frequently been criticized for not being sufficiently active in the responsible business conduct. ASEAN has been proactive, and we've seen what it's done. You have to integrate, and the member countries have to put it on the agenda, political and others, and there's space for civil society. It does not make a great deal of sense to me, to end on this, that whilst of course each of us will develop a national action plan and have its own discourse, how odd and peculiar will it be that we do this as South Asian neighbors without, in a consultative way? We have the wherewithal, we have common issues, we can follow other blocks around the world and see how they've operated, but this has not happened. And as a result, we would be now reading the Pakistani NAP and studying it. Somebody would then maybe a year later look at the Indian one. But where was the partnership right here in South Asia? And why did it not happen? And I think that those of us who are prepared to confront the realities of why it did not happen will bemoan the fact later that wasted resources and out of sync, out of timing activities. I mean, our relationships in terms of migrant labor with at least two of our neighbors is something we all want to improve. But we need an NAP that says the same thing and approximately at the same time. So just like we want business chambers as conglomerates to do it, we expect leadership from our collective association as never before. And we appeal to the leaders of these associations to live up to, expectations of the citizens of the country they are representing at these fora in a serious way.
So good takeaway over there is a need and an opportunity for SARC to work together more towards addressing human rights and due diligence. With that, allow me to turn to you, the participants in the audience, with one more poll question, please. And over here, we would like to ask you, it's a true and false question. The responsibility to respect human rights applies only to large publicly held businesses in industries where the risks of human rights abuses are well known. True or false? Okay, I let a couple of more seconds go by to allow you to answer. I see some responses are still coming in. Okay, we do end the poll now, and with this, I will share the results. So we had a majority of you select false, and there were some of you that did select true. Well, the correct answer is false. The responsibility of business enterprise to respect human rights applies to all enterprises, regardless of their size, sector, operational context, ownership, and structure. This is defined under Principle 14 of the UN Guiding Principles already. However, the means through which enterprises meet that responsibility may vary according to the size of the business, the complexity of the issue, and the severity of the human rights risks. This is also defined under the Principle 14 of the UN Guiding Principles. With this, I would like to say thank you so much I'm going to stop sharing the screen here now. Thank you so much to you, Dorothy and Viraf, for this very engaging conversation. And I'd like to invite Pranav Kumar from CII and Indra Ghosh from the Indo-German Chamber of Commerce in conversation with us. Thank you so much, and welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us today. I would turn to you first, Pranav. Pranav, how is business responding to the due diligence frameworks? And what kind of pressures are they subjected to? What are the rising expectations from stakeholders? And how can business remain competitive?
Thank you very much, Natasha. Thank you, organizer, for inviting me. And in fact, we just heard both the experts from OECD and Viraf from India, and they've covered a lot of issues which are extremely important and pertinent. Viraf particularly explained about the legislative ecosystem which is being developed in India regarding the compliance and enforcement of human rights and other social and environmental standards in India. So in case of India, what I would say that the ecosystem is still evolving. And when we talk about the compliance by businesses and all, so there are many studies, many reports which have been done, and at least by and large, the top companies, they are very much on track as far as the compliance of human rights and other social and environmental standards are concerned. But you have to understand that in case of India, it's a large country, very diversified business. We have a large companies, medium and small companies, large section of the Indian businesses that fall in the informal sector. So to protect the human rights across the value chain, and that also comprises the informal sector and small companies and all. So that's a kind of big challenging task for the government. But the current legislative environment particularly, and Viraf has mentioned about some of them, is largely voluntary in nature. So it goes back to 2013 or 2011 when we adopted the national guidelines, and then the new Companies Act of 2013, where also we introduced CSR concept. But again, that is not mandatory, that is voluntary, of course, with strict guidelines for the compliance and all. And the National Action Plan, again, for responsible business, still under discussion, and it is evolving. So Ministry of Corporate Affairs is working on that front to create a more robust ecosystem for the better compliance and enforcement of the human rights. So that is one aspect of it. On the business front, particularly, if you see the last 30 years, I would say, since the 1991, when we have opened with our economy and Indian industry have started doing more business with the rest of the world. So we have seen that particularly large Indian companies, they have adopted the best practices which came into the country through the MNCs. You name any big Indian companies, their practices are as good as the practices and the systems followed by the large MNCs in India. So because that is the need of the hour, because that brings more positive results, that helps in the enhancing the productivity of your employees, and that all good for the business, because you are competing not in only Indian market. Because the earlier you asked the question with my friend from OECD, Dorothy, about the domestic versus international market, because the kind of the business environment currently we are into at this point of time, this is not the domestic versus international, because the production is spread across the border, is a cross-border production network, and you are trying to integrate into that. So if you're trying to integrate into that, of course, the international environment and domestic environment, you can't make much distinction. And you have to follow and adopt the same practices which apply in international market as domestic market. A company, a large company operating in India, they follow the same international practice. So you have to integrate with their supply chain. You have to follow the best practices, best standards prescribed by them. So that's not an option whether you are operating in domestic market or operating international market. The best international practices have to be adopted. So that is where the challenge for the Indian companies, particularly the small and medium enterprises. So the many data also, one data is that by and large, because of this new compliance on human rights, environmental compliance, social standards and all, still a large section of Indian industry, almost 40 to 50%, they are not in a position to do business with international companies, mainly because they are not equipped enough to comply with this evolving standards, whether it's a human rights, whether it's a labor standards or environmental standards and all. But I would say that it's a combination. What we can do unilaterally, voluntarily, and at the same time, what kind of enforcement comes to the government. Of course, the government cannot overnight bring a very strict enforcement, because that's not the way the Indian law operates. But we give more time to the businesses to adopt and comply with the rules and regulations and other. So what we are witnessing at this point of time, as I said, that the entire ecosystem is evolving. Businesses are also trying to adjust to new reality, because we have to do business with Europe, we have to do business with the other developed countries, other parts of the world, and that the guidelines, the code of conducts which are coming from different international agencies, slowly and gradually Indian businesses are adopting. But the challenge is for the MSMEs, and that is where the more hand-holding, more sensitization from the government that is required. And that is what government is doing in collaboration with the industry association like us, plus civil society organizations. But it will take some time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pranav. With this, Indras, let me turn to you. Maybe if you could help share some perspective with a more directed approach on the German supply chain law and how it impacts business and trade partners.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think this is an important question, especially for South Asia, in particular for, in this case, Indian businesses, since, as you know, India and Germany share a very close relation that goes beyond trade. But let me begin by highlighting and dramatizing that any human rights due diligence regulation originated essentially from consumers and not government, because there is a growing awareness by consumers that companies need to address the adverse impact of their operations toward people, society, as well as the environment. And this created impetus for government to enact relevant regulations and framework, and in this case in Germany. A short overview on the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. There's essentially a law that establishes mandatory compliance for company to make reasonable efforts to ensure that they safeguard human rights and environmental protection within their own operations, as well as in the supply chain. So I like to dramatize this because, again, you are obligated to make the efforts and not to succeed, essentially. And the And if you look at how the Act is going to be implemented in phase 1 from January 23, it will apply to German companies with at least 3,000 employees. And from 2024, it will be expanded to companies with at least 1,000 employees, which in terms of the calculation of employees would include offices all over the world. So you essentially will have two types of impact, direct and indirect, depending on whether you come under the purview of the law or not. For example, if you're a foreign subsidiaries of German companies in India, you will be considered as a German company's own business area, and you need to coordinate with your parent company in Germany to implement human rights due diligence processes. This means essentially large companies need to ensure that you have consistently strong compliance across geographical boundaries, which traditionally is still lacking in terms of voluntary human rights due diligence. On the other hand, for business partners in South Asia, for example, if you are directly supplying goods and services to German companies, you would also be subjected to the law indirectly. And you need also to ensure that you are compliant, upholding human rights standards and manage human rights risks, and implement them in close cooperation with your German buyer. And not only that, indirect suppliers will also be impacted, because once your buyer receives substantiated reports of human rights violation, then you need to act upon that as well. Essentially, I think the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act will create a business environment in which there's going to be a need for buyers and suppliers to develop a much closer relationship in the supply chain. There's also going to be need here for businesses to come together based on shared responsibility to uphold human rights in the economic activities. And if we achieve that, I think we can see a much more integrated global value chain that will be more resilient to economic depression.
Thank you so much, Indras. And thanks for giving that clear direction for what the German supply chain law means for South Asian businesses. Kind of coming back to you, what kind of support is needed and what efforts are observed from the Indian government, as an example, to support business and human rights? Sorry, Pranav, you're on mute.
Okay, so that's a very important aspect and question, I would say, because in a country like India, where the capacity of the businesses, and when I say the capacity of business, I don't mean only the large corporates, but large section of the companies who are MSMEs and of the micro size. They need to be sensitized, and where the role of the government is, because government has a twin objective, a twin responsibility, I would say. First, we have to map the global environment, the evolving global environment, what is happening in Europe, what is happening in America, and all the facts and all. So accordingly, you have to create your own legislative ecosystem so that you can create a sort of legislative framework for the compliance. So once you do that, then of course we have to do the enforcement also. Enforcement requires, you cannot go for very hard enforcement, but before enforcement, you have to do a lot of capacity building and sensitization. So when it involves the compliance by the Indian companies, as I said, that India is a federal country, because there are many of these things that fall in the purview of law and order and governance. And that again is the subject of the state government. The states which may better govern, they would be in a better position to enforce that, and that you have seen the states' attractiveness, particularly in terms of attracting FDI, that varies from one state to other. Some states are more attractive, some states are less attractive in India, as far as the attracting business, attracting investments concerned. And these are the factors which play quite critical role in attracting business, attracting investment. So, government, as I said that in the last 1 decade or so, since 2010-11, trying to create a more kind of effective regulatory mechanism or legislative framework, so that the businesses can find itself more comfortable in terms of complying with the evolving requirement of the human rights and other other social standards. But by and large, what I would say that, of course, businesses have a responsibility, and here also I would say the large businesses, the large corporates have also the responsibility to help the smaller ones, because they are also working with their the small scale players and micro players in their sectors, in their supply chain. So it requires of course, very effective partnership between the government and the industry. And of course, the state government, I would say. When I say the government, is not only the responsibility of the central government, the Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Corporate Affairs, but equally the important role the state governments have to play, because human rights violation and all, many times, and most of the time, it is you can very well say it's a law and order problem, is the poor compliance. And that is, state governments are in a better positions to enforce and protect those rights rather than the central government. So, so this is the situation, and government is I would say is more aware than the business in India, because businesses they have to follow the rules and regulation, and what kind of support mechanism, what kind of ecosystem is created by the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pranav. So a good message there that businesses do need to follow what kind of mandates and directives are shared on that front. Indra, turning to you. How should small and medium businesses perceive the developments towards HRDD, and how can they benefit from the global regulatory requirements?
Thank you for that question. Well, I think as a reminder, I would say one of the core reasons why there is a need for mandatory human rights due diligence is to level the playing field for businesses, regardless of the size of your companies, right? And like if you look at the example in the German Lieferkettengesetz, this is especially true where there is a direct and indirect impact for businesses and suppliers. At the same time, if you look at also the EU proposal for a sustainability due diligence, it is essentially similar regulatory framework on human rights due diligence, which in some ways are actually stricter than the German regulation, because it is applied to companies with smaller number of employees, and also put greater responsibility on toward environmental protection. If I look at this from eagle eye point of view, I think there is harmonization of human rights due diligence law globally. In India, for example, you have the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting, the BRSR, which include a voluntary ESG reporting for small companies. So I think you can already have a sneak peek here of what may happen in the future. And of course, then if you have that, then you have to put small and medium businesses as your crucial partners in upholding human rights in the supply chain. At the moment, while small and medium businesses are not going to be directly impacted, they will be indirectly impacted, and because of the trickle-down effect where large companies would essentially ask for human rights related information from their direct and indirect suppliers. But I think the relationship is not just a one-way street. There is a common interest here for all companies, and therefore there's a need to address also certain aspects like, for example, financial element of implementing and developing due diligence. I think that needs to be addressed very quickly. I would say overall, the global development of HRDD is very good news for suppliers in South Asia, because essentially buyers will be able to provide you with greater capacity building and maybe greater volume of business in exchange of complying to human rights due diligence requirement. In fact, at the moment, many businesses, especially small and medium businesses, do not yet, not many of them have a solid HRDD mechanism. And if you are a small business and you have this mechanism, that's a very compelling and unique selling point for your business, which you can leverage. We have seen several best practice examples where large companies created dedicated program to train their suppliers on capacity building. They would also reward suppliers with recognition as well as more business over a long period of time. Why do you think that is? Because I think large companies also appreciate the role of small and medium enterprises. At the same time, we already know that consumers and investors are more reactive to ethical brands. I think a recent report a couple of years ago says that there's a 60% growth in consumers' willingness to pay more for ethically sourced products, and this is growing each and every year. Again, looking at the current development globally and in India, I would not be surprised if small, medium enterprises would eventually come under human rights due diligence regulations. And I think for them now, this is a good opportunity to expand across local boundaries into international market and be in a stronger bargaining position to demand more from their buyers in terms of economic exchange. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Indras. Yes, and really also coming back to our question earlier, responsibility of business enterprises to respect human rights applies to all enterprises, irrespective of their size and their sector, so even to the small and medium-sized enterprises. Pranav, turning to you quickly, and I'm also keeping an eye on the time. So I would like to maybe ask you one last question over here, and this is also more pertinent to the trade. So what is your observation of trends in trade with regards to sustainability chapters in free trade agreements?
Yeah, the sustainability chapter in trade agreement, that's not a new phenomena, a new concept, because many OECD countries, in fact, many developing countries, those who have entered into trade agreement with OECD countries, US has signed many trade agreement with some Latin American countries, some other countries in Asia also. So all those agreements have a chapter on sustainability. EU has signed trade agreement with Vietnam, which has a chapter on sustainability. But India, from the very beginning, has taken a little more conservative stance on inclusion of sustainability in trade agreement, particularly. So I would say that whether it's a labor standards or environmental standards, human rights and all, whether in the free trade agreement or in the multilateral trade agreement under the aegis of WTO. But now there is change in stance, because we have also realized that there's a new reality. If countries like Vietnam or other countries are responding, they are having and we have to also be more accommodative to the demands of the new emerging demands of the countries. So currently we are in the process of negotiating free trade agreement with UK. With Australia, it is going on. Any day it could be signed. And more challenging one would be European Union. So, and in all these agreements, particularly with the European Union, we are going to have a chapter on sustainability. So when we talk about sustainability chapter, it will have 3-4 components. One, of course, is the most prominent one is the climate change environment. Second is the labor standards. Third is the entire issue of biological diversity and all. So all these would come as a legally binding agreement under the overall legal text of the trade agreement. So in fact, that would also sort of I won't say pressure, but of course that would be a kind of a compulsion on our part to enforce some of those whether it's the human rights or labor standards laws in the country, because in that way, the companies and businesses in India, they would be forced to comply with those, because this is how we try to bring changes. Because as I said that India is a democracy, it's a large country, and changing laws, getting a new law, that also not easy. It takes a good amount of time, sometimes more than 10, 12 years also we have seen in the last many years, because it has to go through parliamentary process and all. So but one good thing is that India has never been a defaulter with regards to international commitment, whether it's on any international agreement, whether it's on the climate change or trade agreement or any agreement. So when it is a matter of complying with international obligations, so of course we tend to fulfill those commitments always. And so indirectly, I would say that if we get into an agreement which is legally binding, that would help us in creating a kind of legislative framework, and that would also help and to enforce some of those the human rights and other labor standards, so that the companies are in a better position to comply. So this is a kind of new development, I would say, in India, because India has taken a very conservative stance over the years on many of the issues. But now we are open up and we are for that. But this is a new for the Indian businesses, because Indian businesses have never been exposed to this kind of issue in the trade agreement. So over the years, only we have dealt with tariff and non-tariff barriers, some issues related to services market access, some issues related to investment protection and all. But getting into the labor standards, environmental standards and all, that is also kind of industry has to raise its level of understanding and see how best industry can contribute to this negotiation and the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pranav. I think some very important messages over there, particularly, to mark the change in the focus, the objectives, and also, underlining importance towards sustainability in trade agreements, and also for India, and upcoming trade agreements that India is looking to make and sign upon. With this last question for you, Indras, and then actually I would invite the panel back to the floor for some questions that we do see from the audience. And on this, Indras, what kind of programs and initiatives, maybe if you can mention just a couple over here before we open to the audience, are available for Indian businesses to meet their responsibility to respect human rights?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think for us, I think the previous speaker also has mentioned, I think if I were to put it broadly, what are the challenges of human rights due diligence at the moment? I would say awareness, capacity building, and the implementation of due diligence. And then later on, you need to ensure that there needs to be consistent quality in terms of implementation, but that's much later on. So in India, we are still in a very beginning of our journey where we are focusing on awareness and capacity building initiative. And this is what has been driving our sustainability chapter, Sustain Markets, with the support, of course, with our member companies and partners. In the last maybe 3 years, we have been ramping up our cooperation with our partners like GIZ, amfori, and the United Nations Development Program to focus on awareness and capacity building. Like, for example, last year, we rolled out a training on the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights in cooperation of Business Scouts and amfori. And this year, we are looking to build upon that with a human rights due diligence workshop for the private sector in India, which is going to occur in 5th of April this year. So, and we look into how do we provide companies in India with the knowledge and also practical steps on the implementation of human rights. That is importantly also aligned with the need of the industry and harmonize with the internationally recognized standards. And this is what the workshop will address. And the second one would be, I think, there is also a demand for and the need for industry-specific training on human rights due diligence. There is no magic bullet, like they say, and we need to look at due diligence on a sectoral level because of the unique challenges within, and of course, the complexity of the Indian market. And for this, we've partnered with amfori and UNDP again to deliver 2 industry-specific training on human rights due diligence for the textile, construction, and real estate sectors. And all of these workshops and training are sponsored, and the contents are, again, designed for Indian circumstances. And we would love to encourage all of you to take part of it on this unique opportunity. And we will be ramping up our activities in this year also. So do stay tuned on that front as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Indras. With this, for the last few minutes, I'd actually like to invite all of the panel on the floor. And we do have a couple of questions from the audience. Pardon me, participants, we may not be able to address all of them in the interest of time, but I would like to at least pick on a couple that our panel can really address over here. So to really start with, there is a question we have. Yeah, and this is maybe for Pranav and Viraf in context. In Europe and the UK, courts are pushing boundaries with respect to holding corporations liable for environmental and labor human rights abuses. Are South Asian courts taking a similar approach? I'll repeat the question for your benefit.
No, got the question. Maybe Pranav, would you like to go first? I'll follow.
Yeah, so question is, are South Asian courts taking a similar approach? So I think it's very difficult to answer because it's requires the judicial interference and of course judicial decision. So, but of course we have our own judicial system and we have a laws, and of course every country is different. So it's very difficult to draw that kind of parallel in our case. But of course, in India, we have a very vibrant judiciary, and many times we have seen that the private sector players, they have faced the wrath of the judiciary, particularly if they have violated, whether it's not only human rights or environmental standards or social standards.
Yeah, I just complement that by adding, thank you for the question. During the time of COVID, its early days, there was certain courts had diluted labor laws as a state subject. And fundamentally, the Supreme Court, I think it was a 3-person bench, came to the rescue and stated that labor rights that were being diluted could not be diluted. This was not an emergency. And even if it were, there would be due process, and these were fundamental rights. So the right to labor rights were linked to fundamental human rights. And this is stunning as a judgment, the recognition, because whether business or not benefited or lobbied for a dilution, giving, I honestly believe, an unenlightened argument that in these difficult times we need to dilute and to worsen and to further pollute. You need to do exactly the reverse. And it's this recognition, if I may just conclude, with the environmental issues. We've seen a lot of strictures from the Supreme Court in the cases of mining, prohibitory orders that have cancelled leases. Again, a boundary between the executive and the judiciary, and they have been crossings from the judiciary to hold the executive accountable. May I just make just one point on this environment, because we haven't said so much about it today. I agree with Pranav. The circumspection, I think, that is proceeding at this time is not only because of new ways that the Indian government want to include in sustainability issues into FTAs and so forth. Last October, I think this coming together.
I will have to literally.
Okay. Yeah. The bringing together or the positioning of environment and climate change, safe and clean one, as a human right. India, China, we abstained from that, not because we don't support clean environment or human rights, because we need to consider the full implications of actually having a legally binding system. So I think the bringing together of climate change as something separate and human rights is no longer the case. It is the human rights impacts of climate change, etc. And this is being very seriously considered. So I do agree with Pranav. There are some things in the pipeline that will emerge over the next few years that I think will be well considered positions certainly from India. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Some very important messages from our panelists and speakers here today. And thank you so much for giving them, highlighting the evolution in HRDD, the changes taking place, what's already impactful, and that's a clear message. This cannot be ignored anymore by any stakeholder or any role player. There is much to be done, and there is much also that is upcoming and to be looked ahead, that we can look forward to. With this, I would like to say thank you very much for all your attention, also you dear participants. Apologies we could not address a couple of more questions over there, but happy to if you reach out to us. Wish you all a very good day ahead. And I hand over to you, Kasika, to conclude the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. So thank you, Natasha. Thank you to our brilliant panelists for today. And who attended. That was a really insightful session on human rights due diligence, and I hope we move forward with whatever we were able to discuss today. And so we still have a few more side sessions, very interesting side sessions as part of the 3rd UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. So we still have the indigenous voices and transforming business operations, and the last one is on corporate capture in South Asia. Please do tune in if you can, and do visit our website. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and hope to see you in the next sessions. Goodbye.